When Katherine Johnson was born in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia in 1918, before her stretched a long life of quiet greatness. At 13, she was attending high school on the campus of the historically black West Virginia State College. At 18, she enrolled in the college itself, and when West Virginia decided to quietly integrate its graduate schools in 1939, at the age of 21, she was handpicked along with 2 other male students to enroll in West Virginia University, the graduate program's flagship campus. She left school after 1 semester, however, to teach and support her family of 5, but when she got wind of the all-black West Area Computing Section at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA's, Langley Laboratory, Johnson moved to Hampton, where she was swept along in NACA's transformation to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and began doing trajectory analysis for frontline NASA projects such as Freedom 7, Mercury Atlas 6, for which she's immortalized in the multi-million-dollar blockbuster movie Hidden Figures, played by Taraji P. Henson, and Project Apollo. Johnson's mathematical work formed cornerstones of the projects in the space race, shaping the military manifestations of the Cold War and, in the end, how it played out in the American psyche. Johnson's employment at the Space Administrations was to provide the math. Originally, she worked in NACA's Flight Research Division, analyzing data from flight tests. When Sputnik was launched in 1957 and she moved to the Space Task Force, her work remained largely the same. She did the dirty work that she went largely uncredited for until the 2016 publication of Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. In fact, in a 1963 NASA report collection entitled Mercury Project Summary, she is conspicuously not mentioned, while her colleagues at the Space Task Force, Robert Gilruth and Max Fauger, are. However, Johnson's work, the pure, unadulterated math, is a foundation upon which the Mercury spacecrafts were able to fly. In Project Mercury, the math influenced every part of the project's development. In a report from Mercury Project Summary, entitled Trajectory Analysis by John P. Mayer and Carl R. Huss, the details of the work she contributed to are shown. The work was broken up into design mission analysis, which impacted the overall system design, operational mission analysis, and specific mission analysis, where missions were designed within the capabilities of the spacecraft system developed, and real-time mission analysis, which, quote, proved very valuable for use in flight control and monitoring. The report ends by stating that the work from, quote, Project Mercury has proved very valuable in application to other manned flight programs. It wasn't just Project Mercury Johnson influenced, it was the whole space race. During her 33 years at NASA, Johnson also authored or co-authored 26 papers, the first woman from the Flight Research Division to do so. She continued to work through the 1960s and did trajectory analysis for Project Apollo, the moon landing which is considered to have won the United States the space race, helping to sink the lunar lander with a moon-orbiting command and service module. She was truly, as aptly named by Shetterly, a hidden figure in NASA's programs that was vital to the cause. Admittedly, Johnson was doing the work that could be done by a computer today, and that was computer-supported in the 1960s. But she was not replaceable by any means. The computers that controlled the trajectory of the flight needed to be programmed with formulas that she helped to develop, and, once programmed, were prone to, quote, hiccups and blackouts. The night before John Glenn's much-delayed flight, as part of the pre-flight checklist, Glenn asked engineers to, quote, get the girl, to run the same numbers by hand. If she says they're good, Johnson remembers the astronaut saying, then I'm ready to go. Glenn asking for Johnson by name shows a specific level of trust. He was placing his life in her calculations, after all. The numbers checked out, and Glenn was able to continue with his flight, which is largely seen as the turning point in the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The space race started in 1957 to 1958, which was declared the International Geophysical Year by the International Council of Scientific Unions, and became a scientific reason for the United States and the Soviet Union to launch space campaigns. The Soviet Union was successful with Sputnik 1. The U.S. was not, with Vanguard 1 bursting into flames upon takeoff. From there, President Eisenhower introduced the 1958 Space Act, and in 1961, after Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, President Kennedy declared that the United States would reach the moon before the decade was over. The civilian space competition continued, with the Soviet Union keeping a competitive edge. However, with John Glenn's 1962 Mercury Atlas 6 flight, the United States began to quickly play catch-up, and, using Project Mercury and Project Gemini as bases, landed the first person on the moon with Project Apollo in 1969. The space race meant more than a scientific accomplishment to the United States. It was highly symbolic, as national pride, but also as a military accomplishment. Both Vanguard and Sputnik served as scientific covers for military undertakings, in the hopes of increasing espionage and nuclear capabilities. In the 5-year period after the IGY, the US and the USSR used space programs to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, use satellite spy technologies, and test nuclear bombs in space. Mentions of pursuing multilateral space programs or space treaties occurred, but stalled, as both sides were hesitant and stubborn. This, however, changed in 1963, as concerns over the health impacts of nuclear testing in space emerged, and later that year, the two nations agreed to ban, quote, a host of activities that might lead to US-Soviet competition in space, nuclear testing, and placing into orbit weapons of mass destruction. This lowered the military aspects of the space race, and changed the meaning of the civilian aspects. Because the two nations could not explicitly demonstrate nuclear power, the civilian programs began to take on military connotations. Surpassing the Soviets in space capabilities wasn't just about being technologically superior, it was about sending a message of intimidation. Sure enough, the message was sent. A 1964 translated Moscow Red Star article claims that NASA's, quote, practical work on the conquest in space has a clearly manifested military trend. The article points to the reconnaissance equipment aboard satellites, the U.S. Air Force's contribution to Project Gemini, and quotes from several U.S. officials praising the military interests in space. NASA's success in 1969 with the moon landing hinted at parallel military development and power, and the effect on the Soviet Union was to search for a new strategy that, quote, did not abandon competition, but that added a new element of cooperation to soften the blows of possible future defeats. In addition, the Soviets could use the goodwill fostered by space cooperation to move the United States towards a more broad-ranging détente in areas of greater Soviet concern, including trade and border security issues. In this way, Katherine Johnson's work in advancing civilian technologies sent a greater military message and contributed to an increased cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And, yes, while everybody working at NASA had the same overall impact, Johnson was doing the integral work on the projects, the math that made it fly, and that impacted every other aspect of the space projects. It was work nobody else wished to do, work which was passed off to her, but she was trusted with it, and they relied heavily on her. Katherine Johnson's mathematical analyses form an important foundation of the Cold War race of military power and superiority, and it is largely because of her work that the United States gained a cooperative edge over the Soviets.